It's the late summer of 1888. The air in the mountains of western North Carolina is crisp, thin, and smells of pine, damp earth, and the wild, untamed spirit of Appalachia. You're on horseback, trailing a small party through dense, overgrown forest. The trail is rough, little more than a deer path in places. Your guide is a young, unassuming man of 26 with a quiet intensity about him, a neatly trimmed mustache, and eyes that seem to be looking at something far beyond the trees. His name is George Washington Vanderbilt. He doesn't look like a Vanderbilt. He lacks the boisterous, world-conquering swagger of his famous grandfather, the Commodore, or the stern, imposing presence of his father, William Henry. He is slender, almost scholarly in his demeanor. But as you break through a clearing and stand with him on a rugged, wind-swept plateau, a breathtaking panorama of the Blue Ridge Mountains unfolds before you. Wave after wave of misty blue peaks stretch to the horizon, dominated by the majestic sleeping giant of Mount Pisgah. George gestures out at the sweeping vista, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. And he says, almost to himself, "This is it. This is where I will build my home." But calling what he built a home is like calling a hurricane a bit of a breeze or the Grand Canyon a ditch. What rose from that mountain plateau over the next 6 years wasn't a house, it was a declaration. A French Renaissance chateau, a fairy tale castle plucked from the Loire Valley, dropped into the heart of the American wilderness. We're talking about Biltmore. Let's try to wrap our heads around the numbers, because the numbers alone tell a story of ambition so vast it borders on madness. 250 rooms. Let that sink in for a moment. To put that in perspective, the White House, the home of the President of the United States, has 132 rooms. Biltmore had nearly twice as many. It boasts 35 bedrooms for family and guests, 43 bathrooms, and 65 fireplaces, each one a unique work of art. The sheer scale is almost impossible to process. Its footprint covers 178,926 square feet. That's over 4 acres, under one roof. Imagine 4 professional football fields laid side by side, and then imagine a single continuous roof covering all of them. That's the size of the ground floor alone. The banquet hall, designed for feasts worthy of medieval kings, has a ceiling that soars 70 feet high with a massive triple fireplace and a pipe organ. The library, a 2-story sanctuary of knowledge, was built to house over 23,000 volumes, a collection George had been curating since he was a boy. And this was all built between 1889 and 1895, a time when most Americans were still living in modest wooden farmhouses, often without electricity, without indoor plumbing, their lives governed by the rising and setting of the sun. A time of backbreaking labor, immense economic upheaval, and a growing chasm between the super-rich and the struggling masses. The cost was an estimated $6 million in the 1890s. That's the equivalent of well over $200 million today, though some economists argue that when you factor in the share of the national economy, it's a number so large it's almost meaningless. A figure closer to $1 billion might be more accurate in capturing the sheer audacity of the expenditure. But here's what makes these numbers even more staggering. Biltmore wasn't built in New York City or Newport, Rhode Island, where such Gilded Age extravagance was expected, even required, among the nation's wealthiest families. It wasn't built as a seasonal cottage to escape the city heat. No, this palace, this monument to one man's singular vision, was built in the remote, rugged, and at the time, deeply impoverished mountains of Asheville, North Carolina. A place of logging camps, dirt roads, and small, isolated communities, a world away from the Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue lifestyle. Which brings us to the central mystery of our story. Why? Why would anyone build something so impossibly large, so unfathomably expensive in the middle of nowhere? What drove this quiet, scholarly man to embark on one of the most ambitious residential construction projects in American history? And perhaps the more important, more hidden question, what was the true cost? Not the cost in dollars and cents, which is staggering enough, but the cost in human lives, in sacrifice, in the sweat and blood and quiet desperation of the thousands of people who made this impossible dream a reality. To answer those questions, we need to understand the man himself, the quiet Vanderbilt, the one who broke the mold, The name Vanderbilt paints a very specific picture. It's a name synonymous with railroads, steamships, ruthless business tactics, and an almost unimaginable fortune. The patriarch, Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, was a titan of industry, a man who clawed his way from a single ferry boat to a transportation empire that controlled the arteries of a growing nation. He was rough, uneducated, famously profane, and brutally effective. He was the epitome of the self-made man, a figure of both awe and fear. His son, William Henry, inherited that empire, and, against all of his father's expectations, doubled its value. The Vanderbilts were America's royalty, and they lived like it. They built colossal mansions along Fifth Avenue in New York, each one a fortress of new money, designed to awe and intimidate their rivals. They threw parties that cost millions, married their daughters to European aristocrats, and generally defined the conspicuous consumption of the Gilded Age. Their name was a byword for power, wealth, and excess. Into this world of high-stakes capitalism and extravagant display, George Washington Vanderbilt was born in 1862. He was the youngest of 8 children, and from an early age, it was clear he was different. While his older brothers, Cornelius II and William Kissam, were groomed to take over the family business, to learn the art of the deal, to expand the railroads and manage the immense fortune, George was left to his own devices, and his devices were books. Imagine the family dinners at their Fifth Avenue mansion, the air thick with cigar smoke and the talk of stock prices, railroad expansion, corporate warfare, and political maneuvering. And there, at the end of the table, is young George, a shy, slender boy with his head buried in a book of French poetry or German philosophy. He was the black sheep, the intellectual in a family of industrialists. His father, a man who valued practicality and profit above all else, was famously exasperated by his youngest son's scholarly pursuits. He reportedly said of George, "He's a good boy, but I'm afraid he'll never be able to make a living." While his brothers were being tutored in finance, George was being tutored in languages. He became fluent in several and could read in 8. He wasn't a businessman. He was a scholar, a bibliophile, a quiet, introspective man who seemed utterly out of place in his own family. He inherited millions, of course, a fortune that would have allowed 1,000 men to live in luxury for 1,000 lifetimes. But he was left out of the core business. He was seen as different, softer, perhaps even a disappointment. But George saw the world differently. He wasn't driven by a lust for more money or more power. He was driven by a passion for beauty, for knowledge, for art, and for nature. He traveled the world, not to conquer it with commerce, but to learn from it. He filled dozens of journals with his observations on art, architecture, and culture. He collected books, not as decorations, but as companions. His personal library, which he began curating at the age of 11, was his true passion. These weren't books bought by the yard to impress visitors, the way so many of his contemporaries did. George had read them, annotated them in multiple languages, engaged with the ideas inside. He corresponded with authors and scholars. He was a genuine intellectual, a rarity among the American aristocracy of his time. In a family that measured success in dollars and railroad miles, George measured it in knowledge gained and beauty appreciated. And it was on one of his travels, not to Paris or London, but with his mother to the mountains of North Carolina, that his life's purpose began to take shape. The resort town of Asheville was gaining a reputation as a health retreat, a place where the clean mountain air could cure the ailments of the wealthy. But George saw something more than a health spa. He saw a landscape of profound, raw beauty, a place that spoke to his romantic soul. This wasn't just about building a big house. This was about creating a legacy that was different from his family's. They had built an empire of iron and steam. He would build an empire of stone and soil. He envisioned a working estate, a place of scientific forestry, of agricultural innovation, of horticultural beauty. He wanted to create a place that would not just impress, but would also improve, a model for the future, a demonstration of how the wealthy could be stewards of the land, not just exploiters of it. He enlisted the 2 greatest designers of the age to help him. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt, the undisputed king of Gilded Age architecture, the man who had built the most opulent mansions for the Vanderbilts in New York and Newport. Hunt was the master of the Beaux-Arts style, an architect who thought in terms of palaces and monuments. He was in his 60s when George approached him with this commission, at the height of his powers and his fame. For Hunt, Biltmore would be his masterpiece, his final and greatest work. He would die in 1895, just as the house was being completed, never seeing it fully furnished and lived in. For the grounds, George chose the legendary Frederick Law Olmsted, the visionary landscape architect who had co-designed Central Park in New York City and was revered as the father of American landscape architecture. Olmsted was even older than Hunt, a man in his late 60s, suffering from the early stages of dementia that would eventually claim his mind. But his genius was still intact, and he saw in George's project a chance to do something he had never done before, to create a landscape on a truly vast scale, to heal a wounded land and transform it into a work of living art. When Olmsted, then an old and somewhat cantankerous man, first saw the site, he was horrified. The land had been ravaged by decades of irresponsible logging and subsistence farming. The topsoil was depleted, the forests were gone, replaced by scrubby, eroded hillsides. He wrote in a letter that the land was very poor and worn, and that it was by no means a promising site for a gentleman's country seat. He advised Vanderbilt to find a better location, but George saw it differently. He saw potential. He didn't just want a manicured garden, he wanted to restore the entire ecosystem. This was the challenge that fired his imagination. He bought up not just a few acres for a house, but 125,000 acres of surrounding land, denuded forests, worn-out farms, entire communities. That's nearly 200 square miles, an area larger than the entire city of Chicago. He was buying a landscape to heal. This was the scale of his ambition. He wasn't just building a house and a garden, he was building a kingdom. With Olmsted's guidance, he would create the first managed forest in the United States, pioneering sustainable forestry practices that are still used today. He hired Gifford Pinchot, who would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service, to manage the Biltmore forests. It was here, on this estate, that the science of American forestry was born. He would create a model village for his employees with a church, a school, and a community center. He was building a utopia in the mountains, a benevolent feudal system with himself as the enlightened lord of the manor. It was a vision that was both progressive and paternalistic, generous and controlling, a perfect embodiment of the contradictions of the Gilded Age. But first, he had to build the house, and that would prove to be the challenge of a lifetime. A challenge that would require an army of men, a river of money, and a level of sacrifice that has been largely forgotten by history. The dream was beautiful. The reality was brutal. To build a palace is one thing. To build it in the wilderness is another entirely. The first and most fundamental challenge was logistics. How do you get millions of tons of materials, limestone from Indiana, marble from Italy, steel from Pittsburgh, priceless antiques from Europe, to the top of a mountain in a region with barely any paved roads? The answer was simple and breathtakingly audacious. You build your own railroad. This wasn't just a matter of laying down some tracks. The terrain was brutal. The railroad had to climb steep grades, navigate around rock outcroppings, cross streams. It required engineering expertise, massive amounts of labor, and a small fortune just to make it possible to begin the real work. But George didn't hesitate. If he needed a railroad, he would build one. Money at this stage was no object. A special 3-mile railroad spur had to be constructed, branching off the main line in the village of Biltmore and winding its way up the mountain to the construction site. It cost George Vanderbilt $80,000 in 1890s money, over $2 million today, just for a temporary track. Day after day, for 6 years, trains chugged up the steep grade, hauling not just stone and steel, but the very lifeblood of the project, the men who would build it. And because this was a self-contained world, they couldn't just order materials from a catalog, they had to make them. On site, they built a massive woodworking factory to mill the tens of thousands of board feet of lumber needed for the floors, walls, and intricate carvings. They built a brick kiln that, at its peak, fired over 32,000 bricks a day. They built workshops for plasterers, for ironworkers, for every conceivable craft. It was a factory town dedicated to a single monumental purpose. At its peak, this was a city of over 1,000 workers, a temporary metropolis of muscle and skill carved out of the forest. You had Italian stonemasons, brought over for their ancestral knowledge of carving limestone, their melodic language echoing across the construction site. You had French artisans for the delicate plasterwork, English woodworkers for the intricate carvings, and Spanish tile setters. And you had hundreds upon hundreds of local men, many of them African American, who provided the raw, back-breaking labor that made it all possible. Imagine the Pied d'Espace scene. The air thick with the dust of sandstone and the smoke of the kiln. The constant clang of hammers on steel, the rhythmic chipping of 100 chisels on stone, the shouts of foremen, the groan of the train hauling another load of Indiana limestone up the mountain. It was a symphony of construction, a relentless 6-year assault on the mountainside, a human anthill of furious activity. And the work was dangerous. This was an era before hard hats, before safety regulations, before OSHA, before any real concept of workers' rights. You were expected to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, dangling from rickety wooden scaffolding hundreds of feet in the air, wrestling massive blocks of stone into place with little more than your own strength and a healthy dose of luck to keep you alive. We know from the estate's own records that injuries were a constant concern. So much so that the workers themselves had to band together and petition the management for a basic safety net. They successfully demanded that any worker injured in the course of their duties be given half pay while they recovered. It was a victory. But think about what it replaced: a policy of zero pay. If you got hurt, if you fell from a scaffold and broke a leg, you and your family simply starved. The project moved on without you. The dangers were real and ever present. Imagine being a stonemason perched on wooden scaffolding 50 feet in the air, with nothing but a rope and your own balance to keep you from falling. You're chiseling a piece of limestone, your hands numb from the cold mountain air, your muscles aching from hours of repetitive motion. One slip, one moment of inattention, and you could plunge to your death. Or imagine being a roofer, working on the steep slate-covered roof, hundreds of feet above the ground. The slate is slippery, the wind is fierce, and one wrong step could send you sliding down to oblivion. And it wasn't just falls. There were accidents with the machinery, with the steam-powered derricks that hoisted the massive stones into place. There were injuries from falling debris, from collapsing scaffolding, from the sheer physical strain of the work. Men suffered hernias, broken bones, crushed limbs. And in an era before modern medicine, even a minor injury could become life-threatening if infection set in. They also fought for shorter hours. In 1892, a group of carpenters facing the shortening days of winter requested to work an 8-hour day instead of the standard 10. It was a reasonable request. With less daylight, the work became more dangerous. The estate's response? They installed special electric lights in the workshop and told them to get back to work. The project's schedule was paramount. The house had to be ready for its grand opening. But for all the hardship, there was also immense pride. These men were building something that had never been seen before. They were part of a grand historic undertaking. The level of craftsmanship is staggering even today. The stone carvings, the woodwork, the plaster details, it was all done by hand with a level of artistry that has been all but lost in our modern machine-made world. Take the stonemasons. They were led by a man named James Sinclair and Company, a firm from New York. They were responsible for the thousands of tons of Indiana limestone that make up the intricate facade of the house. Each block was cut and shaped by hand, hoisted into place by steam-powered derricks, and fitted with microscopic precision. It was slow, painstaking, and incredibly skilled work. These men were not just laborers, they were artists in stone. Inside, the woodwork was just as breathtaking. The oak paneling in the banquet hall, the carved walnut in the library, the intricate ceiling coffers. It was all done by master craftsmen who had spent their lives honing their skills. Consider the library ceiling, for example. It's a masterpiece of carved oak with hundreds of individual pieces fitted together like a three-dimensional puzzle. Each piece had to be carved by hand, sanded smooth, and then assembled on site. It took months of painstaking work by a team of master woodworkers. They weren't just building a house, they were creating a work of art, a testament to the enduring power of human hands. And George appreciated this. He wasn't a distant, imperious employer. He took a genuine interest in the work, in the craftsmen, in the process. He would walk the construction site, talking to the workers, examining their work, offering encouragement. He understood that what they were creating was something special, something that would outlast all of them. And then there was the technology. It looked medieval on the outside, but Biltmore was absolutely cutting edge on the inside. It had electricity from its own power plant, generated by 2 DC dynamos at a time when most of Asheville was still lit by gas lamps. It had central heating, a marvel of engineering that required a complex system of pipes and vents to circulate hot air. It had a refrigeration system, a walk-in cooler that could store vast quantities of food. It even had an electric elevator, a fire alarm system, and a sophisticated internal telephone system. This was a house of the future, a technological marvel hidden inside a fairy tale castle. And it was all made possible by the ingenuity and the sweat of the men who built it. They were the unsung heroes of Biltmore, the forgotten army that turned one man's impossible dream into a 4-acre reality of stone and steel. But what was it like for them? What was the human reality behind the architectural triumph? To understand that, we need to look past the grandeur of the house and into the lives of the people who poured their energy, their health, and in some cases, their very lives into its creation. For 6 years, Biltmore was more than a construction site. It was a society, a complex hierarchical world with its own rules, its own economy, and its own stark divisions. To truly understand the hidden cost of this magnificent mansion, we have to populate it. We have to see the faces of the men who built it and understand the world they lived in. Let's talk about the people who actually made this work. The vast majority of the workforce, the muscle of the operation, were local men from the hills and hollows of western North Carolina. For them, the Biltmore project was a double-edged sword. It was a source of steady income in a region with few other opportunities besides subsistence farming or logging. But it was also grueling, dangerous work that was completely alien to their way of life. These were men who had lived their entire lives in the mountains, following the rhythms of the seasons, working their own land, answering to no one but themselves and God. Now they were punching a time clock, taking orders from foremen, working in massive coordinated teams. It was a jarring transition from the independence of mountain life to the regimentation of industrial labor. But the money was good, at least by local standards. $1 a day could feed a family. And so they came by the hundreds, leaving their farms and their families to build a rich man's dream. And for many of them, working on Biltmore was a source of pride. They were building something that would put their little corner of the world on the map. They were part of history. Years later, their grandchildren would point to the house and say, "My grandfather built that." It was a legacy of sorts, even if it was a legacy of labor rather than ownership. And then there were the specialists, the master craftsmen brought in from all over the world. You had the Italian stonemasons with their melodic accents and their centuries-old secrets for shaping stone. You had the German woodcarvers, the English plasterers. It must have been an incredible melting pot of cultures and languages, a veritable Babel of construction, all crammed together in this remote mountain location. But this melting pot was not a harmonious one. It was a society deeply scarred by the racial prejudices of the era. We know from an 1893 letter from the estate management that there were actually more African American employees than white at that time. They worked side by side, but not as equals. The payroll records, which still exist today, tell a story of segregation. Not integrated crews, but segregated crews working in the same area. White carpenters with white carpenters, black laborers with black laborers. And the pay disparity was stark and institutionalized. A highly trained white stonemason could earn $3.50 a day. A general laborer, a position held almost exclusively by African American men, earned around $1 a day, 3.5 times less, for the same 10-hour day of backbreaking work under the same hot sun. It was a system that explicitly valued one man's life and labor as being worth a fraction of another's, based solely on the color of his skin. There were exceptions, of course, men who broke through the color barrier through sheer talent and determination. A man named George Payne, an African-American blacksmith, was so skilled at his craft that he earned $2 out of 25 a day, more than double the standard laborer's wage. A foreman named William Logan, also an African-American, supervised his own landscape crews, a position of authority almost unheard of for a black man in the South at that time. These were men of immense skill and character who managed to carve out a measure of respect in an unjust system. And this is where the story of George Vanderbilt gets complicated, because while his project was built on a foundation of racial inequality, a system he seems to have done little to challenge, he also made a gesture of extraordinary progressiveness. During the construction, Vanderbilt was approached by two leaders of the local African-American community. They pointed out the lack of recreational and social facilities for his black workers. And Vanderbilt listened. He funded the creation of the Young Men's Institute, or YMI, in downtown Asheville. On September 5, 1891, George purchased the land. The building was constructed in 1892 and 1893, right alongside Biltmore House. Designed by the same supervising architect as Biltmore House, Richard Sharp Smith, this wasn't just a token gesture. It was a magnificent building in its own right, a true community center with a gymnasium, a library, bathing facilities, a swimming pool, and classrooms for children and adults. It became the vibrant heart of Asheville's black community for decades, a place for social gatherings, business, education, and art. By 1910, the YMI had its own orchestra. Churches, schools, and civic organizations used the venue for gatherings. It was a place where African Americans could gather with dignity, in a building that was as fine as any white institution in the city. In 1906, the YMI's board of directors, composed of 49 of Asheville's black leaders, purchased the building from the Vanderbilt Estate for $10,000, making it truly their own. So how do we reconcile these two realities? The discriminatory pay scales on the one hand, and this act of genuine philanthropy on the other. It's a contradiction that lies at the heart of Biltmore and at the heart of the Gilded Age itself. A time of incredible progress and incredible inequality, often embodied in the very same people. Men who could be both patrons and profiteers, enlightened and yet blind to the injustices that propped up their world. But for the average worker, white or black, life was defined by the daily grind, the 10-hour days, the 6-day weeks, the constant danger. Imagine the physical toll, the aching muscles, the calloused hands, the constant risk of a misplaced foot, a falling stone, a snapped rope. There are no official records of how many men died building Biltmore. Such things were not carefully recorded in an era that viewed labor as a disposable commodity, but it's impossible to believe that a project of this scale, in this era, was completed without a significant loss of life. This was the hidden cost, the sacrifice that is not recorded in the architectural plans or the financial ledgers. It's the story of the men who traded their health, their youth, and in some cases, their lives for a daily wage. The men who left their families at dawn and returned after dark, too exhausted to do anything but eat and sleep before starting all over again. They built a palace, but they lived in temporary shantytowns, in rough-hewn barracks, or walked miles to and from their own humble homes. There's a particular poignancy in thinking about the families of these workers. The wives who waited at home, wondering if their husbands would return safely that night. The children who grew up barely knowing their fathers, who were always at work, always exhausted. The mothers who sent their sons off to the construction site, knowing the dangers but needing the income. These families paid a price too, a price measured not in dollars, but in worry, in absence, in the slow erosion of family life under the weight of economic necessity. They created a world of unimaginable luxury, a world they would never be allowed to enter as guests. Their legacy is the house itself, a silent testament to their skill and their sacrifice. Every perfectly carved stone, every polished floorboard, every pane of glass is imbued with their labor. But the story of Biltmore's hidden costs doesn't end when the construction crews went home. The grand house was finally completed in 1895. George Vanderbilt moved in, ready to begin his life as a country gentleman. But the shadows that had gathered during its construction were long, and the greatest tragedies to stain the history of the estate were yet to come. There was one documented tragedy that occurred on the estate grounds in 1922, years after George's death. A security guard named Walter Brooks shot and killed two young men, Lawrence West, age 20, and Emery Lance, age 24, at the Shiloh Gate. The details are murky, the motivations unclear. But it's a reminder that even after the construction was finished, even after the house was filled with art and beauty, the estate was still a place where violence and tragedy could intrude. On Christmas Eve of 1895, George Vanderbilt formally opened Biltmore House, welcoming his family to the magnificent estate. For a few brief, glittering years, the dream was real. The house was filled with life, parties, intellectual gatherings, the quiet pursuit of knowledge in the grand library. George had married the love of his life, Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, a woman of intelligence and grace who shared his vision. In 1900, their only child, a daughter named Cornelia, was born in the house itself in the grand Louis XV bedroom. It was, by all appearances, a perfect life. A fairy tale castle in the mountains, a loving family, a legacy of beauty and science taking root. George and Edith entertained writers, artists, and intellectuals. They hosted elegant dinners in the banquet hall. They rode horses through the estate's forests. They read together in the library. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that George had achieved his dream. He had created a paradise. But beneath the surface of this Gilded Age fantasy, a crisis was brewing, a crisis that threatened to consume the entire estate. The problem was simple, and it was the same problem that plagued so many grand dreams: money. George Vanderbilt was a man of immense inheritance, but he was not a man of immense income. While his brothers managed and grew the family's railroad fortune, George's primary occupation was spending his. And Biltmore was a black hole for cash. It wasn't just the $6 million to build it, it was the astronomical cost to run it. The estate required a staff of dozens of servants, from butlers and footmen to maids and cooks. The gardens required an army of gardeners, the farms, the dairy, the forestry program. They all cost a fortune to maintain. The dream of a self-sustaining estate was a noble one, but it was a long, long way from reality. George was forced to start selling off other assets, consolidating his finances just to keep his mountain kingdom afloat. The financial strain was immense. He was a visionary, not a bookkeeper. He had created a masterpiece, but he was beginning to realize that it was a masterpiece that could bankrupt him. And the world outside Biltmore was changing. The Gilded Age, with its unchecked extravagance and its massive disparities of wealth, was coming to an end. The progressive era was dawning, bringing with it a new sense of social responsibility and a growing distrust of the super-rich. Muckraking journalists were exposing the brutal conditions in factories and mines. Labor unions were gaining strength. The public mood was shifting. The very idea of a man spending millions on a private palace while workers lived in poverty was becoming not just distasteful, but politically dangerous. In 1913, the United States ratified the 16th Amendment, establishing a federal income tax. For the first time, the vast fortunes of men like Vanderbilt were subject to taxation. It was a small percentage at first, but it was a fundamental shift. The era of unlimited, untaxed wealth was over. The government was asserting its right to redistribute wealth, to fund public services, to level the playing field, at least a little bit. For men like George, who had inherited their fortunes and lived off the interest, this was a seismic change. George began to spend less and less time at the estate, closing the house for long periods to save money. The dream was becoming a burden. And then, the unthinkable happened. In March of 1914, while in Washington, D.C., George Vanderbilt complained of indigestion. He was diagnosed with appendicitis. A routine emergency appendectomy was performed, but complications set in: an embolism. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II, the quiet scholar, the man who dreamed a palace into existence, died. He was only 51 years old. The shock was seismic. The visionary was gone. And in his place, facing the mountain of debt and the colossal cash-devouring estate, was his widow, Edith. This is where our story finds its second protagonist, Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt. A woman raised to be a society hostess, now thrust into the role of a CEO of a failing enterprise. She was left with a young daughter, Cornelia, and an estate that was on the brink of financial collapse. This was the true crisis. The house, once a symbol of limitless possibility, was now a stone-and-mortar albatross around her neck. The world was marching toward the Great War. The economy was uncertain. The very idea of a place like Biltmore was becoming an anachronism. Everyone expected her to do the sensible thing, sell it, sell the land, sell the house, sell the art, and retreat to a more manageable life. But Edith had made a promise to George. She had shared his vision. She understood that Biltmore was more than just a house. It was a legacy. It was a commitment to the community, to the land, to a different way of thinking, and she refused to let it die. So, with the world falling apart around her, Edith Vanderbilt, the grieving widow, did something extraordinary. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She took control of the estate's finances, poring over the ledgers, looking for a way out. She was a woman of quiet strength and immense intelligence, and she would need every ounce of it to save her husband's dream from becoming his greatest folly. The survival of Biltmore rested entirely on her shoulders, and the solution she found would be as visionary as the creation of the estate itself. To save a dream, you sometimes have to be willing to break it apart. This was the hard lesson that Edith Vanderbilt had to learn. She was surrounded by advisors telling her to sell, to liquidate, to cut her losses and run. But she saw a different path. A path that would honor her husband's deepest passions while securing the future of the home he loved. George's greatest passion, besides his family and his books, was the land itself. His vision for a scientific, sustainable forest was, in many ways, more important to him than the house, and in that vision, Edith found the secret to Biltmore's survival. She entered into negotiations with the United States federal government. In a move of incredible foresight, she sold nearly 87,000 acres of the estate's vast forest land to be the nucleus of the new Pisgah National Forest. The negotiations were complex, the paperwork immense, but Edith persevered. It was a masterstroke. The sale generated a huge infusion of cash, stabilizing the estate's precarious finances. It dramatically reduced the property taxes and maintenance costs, but most importantly, it fulfilled George's dream. The forest he had so carefully planted and nurtured, the birthplace of American forestry, would be preserved for the public, for all time. He had wanted to create the first managed forest in America. His wife made sure that legacy would be permanent. Today, Pisgah National Forest is one of the most beloved natural areas in the Southeast, visited by millions of people every year. It's a living monument to George Vanderbilt's vision and to Edith's determination to see that vision survive. Edith had saved Biltmore from the brink. She steered the estate through the turmoil of World War I and into the Roaring '20s. She raised her daughter, Cornelia, to understand the weight and the responsibility of her inheritance. In 1924, Cornelia married a British diplomat, the Honorable John Francis Amherst Cecil. The future of the estate seemed, for a time, secure. But another crisis was looming. The stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed plunged the nation and the Cecils into financial chaos once again. The income from the estate's remaining farms and dairy wasn't enough to cover the crushing property taxes on the massive house. Once again, the specter of selling Biltmore, of breaking up the collection, of letting the dream die, became a very real possibility. It was Cornelia and her husband, John, who came up with the second, and perhaps more radical, survival secret. If they could no longer afford to keep Biltmore as a private home, they would transform it. The idea was radical, almost unthinkable. To open the doors of your private home, to let strangers wander through your bedrooms, your library, your most intimate spaces. It was a profound loss of privacy, a public admission of financial need. But it was also a stroke of genius. In 1930, in the depths of the Great Depression, they made the unprecedented decision to open Biltmore House to the public. The first visitors paid $1 to tour the house and grounds. It doesn't sound like much, but in 1930, when the average worker was making pennies an hour, it was a significant sum, and people came. They came in droves. It was a desperate gamble. Would people struggling to feed their families pay to see the inside of a rich man's fantasy? The answer, surprisingly, was yes. It provided a much-needed boost to the local economy, creating jobs in a time of widespread unemployment, and it gave people a glimpse of a world of beauty and craftsmanship, an escape from the grim reality of their daily lives. And so, the final paradoxical chapter of Biltmore's story began. The ultimate private home became a public treasure. The monument to one family's wealth became a source of livelihood for the community. The house, built for Vanderbilt's private enjoyment, was saved by the curiosity of the common man. There's a beautiful irony in this. The workers who built Biltmore, who were never allowed to enter as guests, whose labor was exploited and undervalued, their descendants could now walk through those same halls. They could stand in the banquet hall, gaze up at the 70-foot ceiling, and know that their grandfathers had built this. They could touch the stone that their ancestors had carved. In a strange way, opening Biltmore to the public was an act of restitution, a way of giving back to the community that had made it possible. And the estate continued to evolve. During World War II, Biltmore played a surprising role in American history. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., fearing that the Capitol might be bombed, secretly moved many of its most priceless treasures to Biltmore for safekeeping. Paintings by Rembrandt, sculptures by Michelangelo, the very crown jewels of American art were hidden in the music room of Biltmore for the duration of the war. The house that George built became a fortress for the nation's cultural heritage. So we return to our original questions. Why was it built? It was built because a quiet, scholarly man, a black sheep in a family of ruthless capitalists, had a vision. A vision not just of a grand house, but of a better way of living, with the land. He wanted to create a legacy of beauty, science, and sustainability, a legacy that was his alone. Biltmore was the ultimate act of self-definition. And what was the hidden cost? The cost was immense. It was paid in the sweat of 1,000 laborers. It was paid in the wage gap between white and black workers, a stark reminder of the injustices that built so much of America's gilded glory. It was paid in the unrecorded injuries and likely deaths of men who worked in perilous conditions, and it was paid in the crushing financial burden that haunted its creator to his early grave. Biltmore is a story of contradictions. It is a story of breathtaking beauty and brutal labor, of visionary philanthropy and stark inequality. It is a story of one man's impossible dream and the two women, his wife and his daughter, whose pragmatism and strength saved it from ruin. It is a story of how a monument to private wealth survived by becoming a public spectacle. Today, Biltmore is still owned by the descendants of George and Edith Vanderbilt. It is not a museum, but a private, profitable business. The preservation of this historic landmark is funded not by government grants or charitable donations, but by the millions of visitors who walk its halls every year. The philosophy of preservation through self-sufficiency, the core of George's original vision, is, in a strange and unexpected way, alive and well. So the next time you see a picture of that fairy tale castle in the mountains, look closer. Look past the soaring turrets and the graceful arches. See the ghosts of the 1,000 men who built it, the Italian stonemasons, the African-American laborers, the carpenters who fought for an 8-hour day. See the quiet scholar who dreamed it all and the strong woman who refused to let that dream die. Because the story of Biltmore is not just the story of a house, it's the story of America. A story of ambition, sacrifice, injustice, and the enduring power of a beautiful, complicated, and very, very expensive idea.